They will try to bait you to share. Remember, they need your vulnerabilities as the swords and the machetes they use to maintain power in the relationship. And if you don't hand your vulnerabilities over to them, then they will start shaming you for being closed off and being incapable of intimacy and trust and closeness. How do we figure out our holes and our wounds first? Because it can really be an important thing to know about ourselves, because oftentimes the very kind of lock we've got, sadly, their key often fits perfectly. It's very easy when we're talking about narcissistic relationships to get caught up in the idea of red flags and the charm offensive and all of the stuff that either makes the narcissistic person so irresistible in the beginning, or the signs that we should have been clever enough to see. I have talked to enough survivors to know that there really aren't always red flags that made sense until we look backwards. And think about when you have watched, for example, a mystery movie or a TV show or a film that had little signs like little hidden Easter eggs scattered throughout it. So you'd have to watch it again to get them. But that means that you didn't get them probably the first time. And unlike, you can go back and watch a murder mystery movie as many times as you want, but there are rarely do-overs in life. It's also easy to forget that even more than the good morning, my princess kinds of texts and I thought about you all night BS texts you get, or the I feel like we're soulmates, or the perfect courtship and the Instagram posts of you dancing together until dawn nonsense, that what narcissistic people are really good at is that sort of data download. They are like CIA operatives, figuring us out, asking the right questions, getting to the core of our vulnerabilities, figuring out what the shape of our lock is. And instead of us feeling like someone is being a detective or running a con, we think that this person is absolutely besotted with us. The love bombing that they're doing means that we think that they're just intensely curious, the first person who really ever wanted to get to know us. And if that comes on the heels of childhood and familial relationships, where you also never felt seen or heard once upon a time, it's a lot more seductive than a candlelight dinner or a good morning text. Because the best way to avoid narcissistic people in adulthood, there isn't much you can do to avoid it when it's parents and family, but new onset relationships in adulthood is obviously not to get into one of these relationships in the first place. And that's not easy to do, right? There's some things we can do, little bits, like we can get knowledgeable about narcissism. We can recognize that it's real. We can build up our discernment muscle, give ourselves permission to be discerning, figure out what people need, and all of that is a key piece of individuation. And part of all of that are those unmet needs that we have always had, right? If you had narcissistic parents, it's not unusual to have the deep and acute need to be really seen, heard, regarded, valued, or respected, or even held, acknowledged when you walk into a room. It can seem like if that happened, you would feel whole again. Now, if that had happened when it should have, it wouldn't be so powerful. But in the absence of that, it fosters a sort of yearning in us, right? Those unmet needs that sort of lock, as it was little lock-shaped holes in us, key-shaped holes in us, may be a need for trust and safety, and things like money, the sense that it would be sort of physically protected and kept safe, confidence, ambition in another person. All those things may be stand-ins for that. When a person is standing in front of us, we make certain assumptions or interpretations about them. We may see the person who's talking a big game or is deeply confident. We may see them as having it together and that they know what they want and that can be experienced as safety. These superficial, shiny, narcissistic characteristics and tactics can be interpreted and experienced as us having someone sort of filling a hole, like I said, filling in that lock in us that we want filled. We all have those parts of ourselves. Think of it as a craving for food. The argument is that sometimes we crave foods that might contain a nutrient that we need. Unless you're craving spicy Cheetos or Oreos, then you're on your own, because that's not about nutrients, and I definitely feel you on those cravings. But when that charm and charisma, confidence, swagger, curiosity, that it feels like exactly that they're exactly what we wanted, and that the universe has sent them to be our person. But when that feeling comes up, stop, look inward and ask yourself, what deeper issue, what deeper feeling in me, what deeper need in me is being addressed here? Because knowing that is crucial, just for us to know even before we meet anyone, before we descend into the possibility of a manipulative phase with somebody. And when trauma bonding kicks in and we start making excuses, it gets tricky. Love bombing works because the interaction of whatever they are selling and whatever it is that we need. That's why the same narcissistic bag of tricks doesn't work for everyone. Someone you fall hard of, a narcissistic person you fall hard for, perhaps a friend of yours would have been turned off from the very beginning. Not because your friend is smarter than you or more discerning necessarily, but because what is being delivered by the shiny new love bomber is not what they need. And vice versa. Some of your friends may have fallen into narcissistically abusive relationships that you realize that you wouldn't have been vulnerable to this person. We all have different keyholes, wounds, call them what you want. I mean, I think personally to myself, I had a friend who got in deep with a really gorgeously well put together, really stylish narcissistic person who knew about fancy stuff and wine and stuff, and was a horrible person and monstrously manipulative. I don't like fancy stuff, and I don't like people who know about fancy stuff. So that kind of thing would not have filled that space in me. But for her, it was very appealing. So you see what and many others, frankly. We are not all equally vulnerable to the ground game of each and every narcissistic person. And understanding these nuances is important in the development of discernment. We need to know what makes us sort of sit up and listen. So what do? First of all, we've got to be our own sort of keyhole and soul fillers. Now, most pointedly, that would come through meaning, purpose, self-compassion, being self-aware, recognizing that almost all of us have something that's happened to us and being kind to ourselves as a result. That the sort of wanting to be cared for, that's an example. Like people say, this person felt like they were going to take care of everything, and that wanting to be cared for. That could be an outcropping from a childhood where you might have been parentified at an early age, made to care for your parents, made to care for your siblings, never had your needs valued. You were never heard. You kind of felt that in order to get love, that you had to step up into adult responsibilities before you were ready. So when someone rolls around who may be financially successful or talks about a big, stable future or may have the means to take care of you, it may fill this sort of this keyhole, this need. And the healthier play is to acknowledge that need, understand where it came from, take steps within yourself, and recognize, because you know its origin story, that when someone does come around with what seems like the answers that key that fits that lock, that could bring us into potentially very trauma-bonded waters. Another example could be someone who is interested in what we do, asks lots of questions. In those cases, we may feel really heard. And then the relationship may level up because of this. But over time, what was once their interest in you, which filled a deep core wound, need, hold, then it becomes competitive or jealous. But the satisfying, the sating of that initial core dynamic is what is so powerful. Knowing this about ourselves isn't just about narcissist resistance. It's about feeling more whole within ourselves, which no matter what, narcissist or no narcissist, that's overall better for our mental health. It's quite a heavy lift psychologically and requires deep, existential, humanistic, and radical acceptance work, while silencing the voices of the world that are always telling us to be more and to be better. But it can be done, and as you do it yourself, you recognize that other human beings are complementary to you and not a psychological necessity. And as you understand that, you will be less vulnerable to the charms not just of potential narcissistic partners, but also narcissistic friends, colleagues, and the other rogue narcissistic people that may come into your life. But above all else, doing this, narcissist or no narcissist, it's going to be better for you. Here's the bottom line. The narcissistic folks behave badly and mistreat us, and that's not okay. I always tread lightly when I'm talking about people's vulnerabilities, because vulnerabilities are no vulnerabilities. The way folks with these personalities have conducted themselves, invalidating, gaslighting, that's not okay. But the fact is, we are all navigating a world full of these personality styles, and people with these personality styles get rewarded for it. So we need to get our own defenses shored up to make us less vulnerable. Always remember again, those locks, those key-shaped holes, vulnerabilities, wounds, call them whatever feels best to you, did not ever mean that you ever invited narcissistic abuse or that you somehow deserved it. Never. It means that all of us need a great roadmap to point out these hazards, to give ourselves permission to be good and compassionate with ourselves, and to really focus on how their manipulative ground game works. You kind of have to evoke your inner cynic. There is a complex series of steps that happens between the first contact with a narcissistic person we meet when we are an adult and getting sucked into the vortex. We have to get honest with ourselves about our myopias, the things that we sometimes miss because someone comes along with exactly the thing we feel we need. And if someone rolls up and fills one of those spaces within us, one of those needs, we start to associate with them. We start to associate them with that being that sort of need filler. And over time, just like one of Pavlov's dogs, they become classically conditioned as that thing we need, that gets us, that we need, that helps us feel better inside. And that can make it harder to get out. All of us have the capacity to fill those spaces in ourselves. We all have to be aware of them, recognize where they come from, and grieve them. But also be aware that just when someone does come along and starts filling them and addressing them, to recognize that we are naturally more vulnerable at those times. If you're lucky, this sort of person who fills these spaces in you is a good person, and then you're off to a very beautiful relationship. If you're not so lucky, then it's a narcissistic person who has figured out those holes in you and has given you exactly what you need, which makes it all the more powerful and hurtful when they take it away once they have your supply exactly where they want it. So much of what healing from narcissistic relationships are, and then as we heal and get back out in the world again, pay attention to it, is also being aware of these patterns within ourselves. The things in us that, why we might say that, the reason a ambitious person was so important was because you came from a home where you had very financially irresponsible parents. We can always sort of make sense of that. But the earlier you can make sense of that, but ideally before you make the decision on new relationships, new jobs, new friendships, can make a big difference. And above all else, remember, you have the capacity in you to be that for yourself. Never outsource the work of your soul. Insecurity, sadly, is a rather universal phenomenon. All of us have something where we don't feel completely self-possessed on it. In the luckiest cases, it's people who are lighthearted, like, I can't bake a pie, or can't change the oil in my car. For other people, it goes a little deeper. They feel insecure about their entire body image, about their intellect, and then they limit themselves in the situations they'll put themselves into, or they'll minimize themselves, or they won't try for their goals because they just feel like they're insecure. They're not good enough. That insecurity message often comes from many of us from childhood, where people simply weren't paying attention or weren't communicating to us our strengths. Kids learn their strengths by being told by adults. If they get enough communication about their strength and resilience as a child, they internalize that. And as adults, they don't need to hear it from the world anymore. They're pretty self-possessed of what they know. None of us know everything. Trust me, you'd never want to eat a pie I can bake, but I write well. We know our strengths, we know our limitations, and that's what sort of the core of a sense of security is. However, the only person more insecure than all the rest of us who have our little bits of insecurity are the narcissists, who are experiencing what we call pathological insecurity. And the reason I call it pathological is for a few reasons. Number one, it's a lot more severe than what the rest of us are. It's like me and my pie. Like, I know I can't bake a pie, so I won't try to make my own pie crust. And if I did, I know it's not going to be very good, and I probably wouldn't be hurt if someone said something bad about it. Like, yeah, I know. And I have that insight. And I have my insight about, all of us have insights about what our other traits are. I'm incredibly stubborn. I know that about myself, and that can often make me a bad travel companion. Narcissists don't have insight into their insecurities. They think they're all that and then some. They're grandiose, they're great, they're perfectionistic. They think they're on top of the world. They're the best. And they expect the world to validate them. Why? Because they don't really believe that. Here's the rub. They're not in touch with that. Whereas I can sit here and tell you I can't bake that damn pie. They're not in touch with the fact that they are insecure. It is such a deep, deep, driven down into their primitive core part of themselves that their whole world is organized around protecting that damaged inner core that they have without even knowing that that's what they're doing. Because of that pathological insecurity that they do not have insight into, they are often very angry. And all of their defenses are around protecting that. That's why they're often rageful. That's why they often disproportionately brag about themselves. It's why they're grandiose. It's why they're entitled. It's why they lack empathy. All of that to protect that core, dark, demonic insecurity they have. Here's where it gets tricky. Think of it as a big fish eating a little fish. Both fish. Okay? The narcissist in this case is the big fish. Their insecurity is much bigger than ours. But we got some. Many of us who've ever been in a relationship with a narcissist will reflect on the fact that, damn, this narcissist almost literally figured out what my vulnerability was, and they went right in there. It's like they were paying such attention to me. And in some ways, that's one of the narcissist's great talents. That's why they're such good salespeople. They're able to identify that vulnerability and exploit it to their advantage. Initially, they will take that vulnerability and say, are you kidding me? You're a great pie baker. You're beautiful. You're so smart. You're so great. They win you over, but they remember it. And after the love bombing's done and down the road, they'll go after your body image or your attractiveness or your intellect or your pie baking. They'll remember that vulnerability. The very way they drew you in, put it into some sick vault in their mind, and use it later on to invalidate you. Their insecurity not only makes them so good at sensing out other people's insecurities, but it also means that they play upon. It's almost like they take, if they're the big fish with this much insecurity, we're the smaller fish with our smaller bit of insecurity. Not only do they suck us in, they magnify our insecurities. They can often leave us feeling that the world is a more dangerous place than it is. They're often quite hypersensitive and paranoid, so that drives it. They may make us feel like things aren't going to go well for us. Why? Because if they diminish our belief in ourselves, make us feel like, oh, are you kidding me? You're never going to go to graduate school, or you're never going to get that job, or I can't see you getting that promotion. You're not going to try. And if you don't try, and if you don't succeed, then their insecurity that you might actually go up or even exceed them, become a bigger fish than them, they can keep you right down where they need you. That's what I mean about the very pathologically insecure preying on the less insecure. I have been alive 54 years. I recently had a birthday. And in my 54 years, I have never met someone who doesn't have at least one insecurity. Sometimes they're charming and sweet and well-managed insecurities, and sometimes they're quite overwhelming. But those insecurities not only make us lovely, but they render all of us a tiny bit vulnerable. Let's use that salesperson analogy again. If you go into a place and you're going to make a purchase, and that salesperson senses that one vulnerability you have, let's say you don't like the size of your hips or a part of your body. A salesperson's clever enough to sense that, or you would communicate it, they're going to try to tell you that this article of clothing is going to completely address that. So it is about, all of us have that, and all of us want those little insecurities at some level to be assuaged. It's why we buy stuff. It's why we buy certain pieces of clothing or certain accessories or whatever. Help us address some of those insecurities for a moment. It's why consumerism works. It's why capitalism works. But when it comes down to it, that insecurity, if you meet someone for a healthy relationship, we've both got them. And I actually say one of the definitions of a loving relationship is when two human beings come together and you both become aware of each other's insecurities, that from a place of love, you protect them in that space. So if you know, for example, someone has an insecurity about speaking a language well, instead of mocking them for speaking that language with an accent or not knowing a word, you say, no, that was absolutely brilliant. You know, I completely understand what you're saying. And protect them. That's love. The pathological insecurity of the narcissist, where they exploit your insecurities and weaponize them and use them against you, that's not love. People who grow up in narcissistic family systems often get much more insecurity that takes them from childhood into adulthood, because not only did they not get normal levels of mirroring, they experienced lots of invalidation, lots of confusion, and they spent most of their time being the narcissistic supply for their parent. Those insecurities can make a person even more vulnerable to the pathological, rageful, angry insecurity, the big fish insecurity, as it were, of the narcissist. This dynamic is really important to know, because one thing that often happens is that for any of us who have normal levels of insecurity, we know how important it is to us that somebody understand us. That if somebody knows we have an insecurity, that we're like, thank you for understanding my insecurity and being kind. We want someone to cut us some slack for that. That makes it more likely that we're going to cut the pathological insecurity, the big fish insecurity of the narcissist, that we're going to cut them some slack too. They're just insecure because their dad was mean to them. They were just insecure because their mom did this to them. They're just insecure because whatever. We make excuses for the big fish. You're like, well, come on, doc. That's a compassionate thing to do. It is to a point. If you want to say, I understand why the big fish behaves the way he or she does, by all means. But to stick around for the chronic abuse, not okay. Keeping in mind this sort of dynamic, this pathological big fish insecurity overwhelming your small fish insecurity, certainly you can say compassionately, I understand where their insecurity comes from, but I also understand I don't deserve to be treated that way. That's where our own insecurities can get in the way, because we're not able to make that bold statement that I don't deserve to be abused. Somehow we keep giving narcissists second, third, fourth, and fifth chance. In fact, I would argue that the more insecure a person is, the more second, third, fourth, and fifth chances they give. You don't have to be mean to push the big fish away. You can understand where they're coming from and very slowly swim away. But be clear on that dynamic and understand that their big, big insecurity, even though it comes off as grandiosity and arrogance and meanness, it's still insecurity, and it's no match for your little guppy insecurity. So don't think you can master it. Understand it when it's coming, and learn that you can compassionately get out of there.
Now, something that often gets forgotten about in the love bombing phase is that it's during the love bombing phase that something that is actually quite dangerous happens in narcissistic relationships. It's a process that I term the unveiling of the vulnerabilities. In fact, as part of love bombing, some narcissistic people will actually go fishing for these vulnerabilities. They'll stare into your eyes and ask you, what's your greatest fear? Or what are you most worried about? Or what don't you like about yourself? You'll think, ooh, this is the beautiful sharing of love. This is what a relationship should be, talking about stuff deep. And I'm in something now with someone who wants to go deep and have these deep conversations. The narcissist may even play with you a little and share some of their vulnerabilities, though I'm not so sure they're giving you a true look at theirs. But the vulnerabilities may be shared, and a good love bomber may even promise to forever protect you and keep you safe, and some such fiction. If you do try to pull the narcissist's vulnerabilities out, they may pull a clever gambit saying something like, oh, come on, I'm happy to talk about it, but you never get to talk. You're always the kind of person who makes time for other people. Now it's your turn to share about yourself. They're just like the wolf in Little Red Riding Hood. All the better to use them against you in the future, my dear. But they don't say it. They just let you talk. And then the day comes, and it will come. Maybe it'll start in the devalue part of the relationship. It will definitely happen in the discard. And it sure as hell will happen if you don't fall for the Hoover. They will use your vulnerabilities against you. They will use every wound, fear, trauma, secret that you ever mentioned to them. All will be mobilized and turned into weaponry, and then bam. The way they do this might come in through really awful emails, text messages, letters, phone messages, or just in good old-fashioned conversation. They will go after anything that is one of your vulnerabilities. They will go after your appearance, or your work, or your parenting, or your friends, or your family, or your mental health, or your physical health, or your traumas. Anything they know will get to you. It's actually a cruel and clever gambit. They use precisely the one weapon you cannot fight back against. You are often so blindsided that somebody would do this or could do this that you're not able to easily recover when you see that someone's doing this to you. And your sympathetic nervous system reactions will kick in. If you have any history of trauma and someone does this to you, it is really difficult to recover. A sort of overwhelming with emotion that can leave you frozen, depressed, detached, and in the most severe cases, even dissociated. The narcissistic personality and their constant monitoring of the world around them for threats, their use of projective defenses, coupled with their tendency towards vindictiveness, but all of this happening against a background of being quite interpersonally cunning and calculating, is what underlies them doing this. There is not a single narcissistic or high conflict personality person I have ever heard of in which this mobilization and weaponization of another person's vulnerabilities does not occur at some point. Every divorce, every family bust up, every business or workplace dismantling. When the relationship goes south with a narcissist, watch out. Any confidence, weakness, secret, or vulnerability will be played back for you to shame you. It is actually one of their most gruesome plays, and is often the one that when I work with survivors, they will often say to me, this was the final hammer's blow. Now that you know that they're capable of this, it really begs forever the question, is this ever going to be a healthy place to hang out? All trust is gone after that. I leave clients to decide for themselves, right? Some people go back. But even when you go back to any kind of human relationship where someone could do this to you, the relationships remain eggshell and betrayal-ridden wastelands. This, using your vulnerabilities against you, is really poisonous when it comes from a parent. They know exactly your vulnerabilities because they have been there from the very beginning. They know the things that scare you at night. Your tendency to wet your bed, your struggles with weight, your experiences with bullying, your lisp, your challenges with math, even your trauma histories. And a narcissistic parent, if the battles between you and them get dark enough, they'll go there. This has actually been some of the worst narcissistic abuse that I've ever seen, as a person is forced to grapple with childhood wounds that happen to a child's mind, but have to manage it on an adult battlefield. This approach of weaponizing and using a person's vulnerabilities against them will also often be used in divorces. Somewhere in your 20-year marriage, you may have shared who knows what, a youthful indiscretion, a wild night you had when you were young and hadn't even met your partner yet. And yet, in a deposition or other court proceeding, you will be painted as a wild partier, or as a person of weak moral character, or as a person who is struggling with addiction. In the workplace, this also becomes a real problem because within the workplace with a colleague or someone, you may share something that, if known, could be detrimental for the workplace or your place in it. For example, a little bit of gossip or a secret you learned about the workplace. And while there may be some protections against this, the reputational damage to you in the workplace will definitely persist. Obviously, when we talk about healthy relationships, as trust gets built, sharing vulnerabilities is good. Obviously, walking around with everything in your life bottled up is never good for us. Being open with ourselves and those we trust, feeling whole with those that we love and who are safe, that's a healthy relationship. Unfortunately, in the early phases of the relationship, a narcissistic relationship can often mimic a healthy one. By the time it starts to go upside down, you may have already shared about yourself, your vulnerabilities, mistakes, things that have happened in your past. And so that means the narcissistic person already has the weaponry. It's actually very interesting. I was watching a documentary about the sex cult NXIVM, and one of the weapons they used in this cult was something that they called collateral. In essence, the people who were sort of higher in the cult hierarchy, the more abusive people, they would ask for the cult members to prove their devotion and loyalty to the cult, to the system, by sharing something like a nude photograph or a family secret or other secret that the person would never want to have revealed as collateral to sort of cement the relationship. Now, let's face it, anyone who's in a cult is too confused to fully understand what's happening to them, and often will buy into this sort of fantastical idea of transparency and trust and belonging and all the stuff that the cults are so good at falsely promising. The cult leaders then put that collateral in their back pocket to use against the member should they decide to speak out or step away from the system or from the cult. Calling it collateral is certainly a fancy and nicer word than calling it what it is, which is extortion. This collateral is, in essence, what anyone in any narcissistic relationship hands over when they share their vulnerabilities, and is what the narcissistic person uses to keep a person trapped in the relationship. The fear that your vulnerabilities will be aired to the world and used against you or to harm people you care about. All narcissistic relationships are cult-like in their organization and structure. It's a small cult, I guess a cult of two in some cases, but a cult nonetheless. To get into these relationships, you were typically groomed, tricked, and your vulnerabilities played upon. It's all just a matter of scale, and that is not a healthy relationship. After a person survives a narcissistic relationship, I will be frank. After you go through that, you're probably not going to be honest and open in the same way again. Trust starts to mean something different. It can take a long time, if ever, for someone to open up in the same way. Some people will save any kind of vulnerable sharing for very carefully curated settings, for example, like therapy. Early in a relationship, you'll already have this lingering doubt. You already play out, like, what would happen if this person turned on me and uses anything I say against me? And for many people who've been through severe narcissistic abuse will decide that not sharing is just easier, that the risk would never be worth it again. People like to say that hurt people hurt people. I'm not buying it. Hurt people who are reactive and egocentric and who lack empathy, they hurt people. Then it isn't really about them being hurt. It's about them being vindictive. Interestingly, after these tantrums, when they use all of your vulnerabilities against you, narcissistic and vindictive folks will often attempt to pass an olive branch and make peace. I wasn't at my best. I was hurt. This trying to fix it is actually hoovering. And they may at this point even future fake promises. We can talk this out. It won't happen again. You can't talk it out, and it will happen again. They will also say things like, don't be mad. Don't be upset with me. And that is because they don't actually really care about your hurt. They just want to mask their own shame and maintain their mask to the world. It's generally not a good look to be the vindictive person. And because narcissistic people are stupid enough to put things in writing, you've got the messages now if you care to show people them. I often think of the bad behavior that a narcissist will engage in these vindictive tantrums as showing their full behavioral repertoire, showing what they're capable of. And for this reason, if people accept the hoovering and the false promises and the let's make nice after one of their sessions of being so abusive and vindictive and using your vulnerabilities against you, there can be some real eggshell walking and some real fear if you do decide to go back. There will always be the fear that they will do this to you again, which is reasonable because they will. And that means that the difficult person in the relationship still holds all of the power. For a variety of trauma-bonded and cognitive dissonance-driven reasons, we want to believe in these relationships. If for some reason you do go back into a relationship where this has happened, move very, very, very tentatively and very carefully. Try that firewalling technique I talked about in another video. Try gray rocking and share nothing that can ever be harmful to you. In essence, you really are living in the truth of a narcissistic relationship. It carves out into something very hollow and superficial because it always was. They will try to bait you to share. Remember, they need your vulnerabilities as the swords and the machetes they use to maintain power in the relationship. And if you don't hand your vulnerabilities over to them, then they will start shaming you for being closed off and being incapable of intimacy and trust and closeness, and portray you as some sort of cut-off, friendless, cold, robotic introvert. Remember the mantras of the narcissistic relationship. It won't change, and you can't win. This harnessing of your vulnerabilities to attack you, manipulate you, punish, cajole, and vindicate themselves is the cruelest element of these relationships and is often where a lot of the hurt happens. It is a cautionary tale that in any relationship, really, really always work towards building lots and lots of trust before you open up about anything, especially if you have a family history of managing narcissistic abuse. If this happens within a family relationship, where they may take advantage of childhood vulnerabilities, be aware it may happen. And remember, it's their shame that is driving this. Don't let it become your shame.
But the other thing to remember is you may be wondering, so what happens in a healthy relationship if you share your vulnerabilities? Because not all healthy relationships last forever. And this is what happens in a healthy relationship. Even if for some reason in a healthy relationship you part ways, no healthy person would ever use your vulnerabilities against you. They may just put them aside in their mind and say, okay, that ran its course. Healthy people have empathy, even when things don't work out. They do not define their relationships on the basis of triangulation, manipulation, and vindictiveness. They find a way to regulate their disappointment. There is a big difference. Pay attention to this pattern, because the fact is, it would never show up in a healthy relationship. Thanks again.